I fed a starving dog in the rain, and it cost me everything I had worked for. But what I did not know then, what I could never have imagined as I stood in the mud with my belongings in a single carpet bag, was that this small act of mercy would bring a queen to my door and change the course of my life forever. My name is Cecily Whitmore, and I was born in the small village of Ashworth, in a cottage so modest that the wind found its way through every crack in the walls each winter. I remember the smell of that cottage still, wood smoke and lavender, and my mother's rosemary bread baking in the old iron stove. I remember the way the frost formed on the inside of the windows each January, delicate patterns like lace against the gray morning light. I remember my father's hands, rough and calloused from work, and the way he would lift me onto his shoulders when I was small so that I could touch the lowest branches of the apple tree in our tiny garden. My mother was a seamstress, possessed of a skill with needle and thread that drew customers from villages miles away. She taught me to sew before I could read, pressing fabric between my clumsy fingers and guiding my stitches until they were straight and true. She also taught me that a woman's worth was not measured by her birth or her fortune, but by her character, by the choices she made when no one was watching, by the kindness she showed to those who could offer nothing in return. My father was a tenant farmer who worked land that would never be his own, rising before dawn and returning after dark, his body bent from labor, but his spirit unbroken. He died when I was 19, taken by a sudden illness that swept through the county like a dark wind, leaving behind debts that consumed what little we had. My mother followed him within the year, her heart simply giving out one cold February morning, as though it could not bear to beat in a world without him. I was alone then, truly alone, with nothing but my wits and my determination to keep me from the workhouse. I sold the cottage, what remained of it, and used the meager proceeds to secure lodging with a respectable widow in the nearby town. I studied. I read every book I could borrow from the vicar's wife, devouring histories and novels and philosophical treatises with an appetite that surprised even me. I practiced my penmanship until my hand cramped and my fingers bled, filling page after page with the elegant script that might, if I were fortunate, earn me a respectable position in a great house. And I learned to conduct myself with the quiet dignity that such a position would require, to speak properly and move gracefully and keep my opinions to myself unless asked. It was not the life I had dreamed of as a child. I had imagined marriage once, and children, and a home of my own filled with love and laughter. But dreams are luxuries that the poor cannot afford, and so I set them aside, locking them away in a corner of my heart, where they could not distract me from the practical business of survival. By the time I was 23, I had secured a position as governess at Thornwood Manor, one of the finest estates in all of Hampshire. The letter of engagement had arrived on a Tuesday morning, sealed with crimson wax and bearing the Fairfax crest, and I had read it so many times that the paper grew soft beneath my fingers. It offered a salary that seemed like a fortune to someone of my circumstances, along with room and board and the promise of respectable work in a household of unimpeachable reputation. The house itself was magnificent, a sprawling testament to generations of Fairfax wealth, with its gray stone facade and endless windows that caught the morning light like diamonds. I remember my first sight of it, viewed from the window of the hired carriage that bore me along the winding drive. It rose from the landscape like something out of a dream, 3 stories of elegant Georgian architecture surrounded by formal gardens and ancient oak trees. Ivy crept up the eastern wall, softening the severe lines of the stone, and smoke curled from a dozen chimneys, suggesting warmth and life within. Gardens stretched in every direction, formal hedgerows giving way to wildflower meadows, and beyond them, forests so ancient that local legend claimed fairies danced among the oaks on midsummer nights. There was a lake, too, I would later discover, fed by a stream that tumbled down from the hills above, and a maze of boxwood hedges that had taken 3 generations of gardeners to cultivate into its current splendor. But the beauty of Thornwood could not mask the coldness that pervaded its halls. I sensed it the moment I stepped through the great oak doors, a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. The servants spoke in whispers, careful never to draw attention, their eyes downcast and their movements quick and nervous. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, ruled the domestic staff with an efficiency born of fear, her thin lips pressed into a permanent line of disapproval, her gray eyes missing nothing. And the footmen moved through the corridors like ghosts, seen but never heard, their livery immaculate and their expressions carefully blank. There was no music in Thornwood Manor, no laughter, no casual conversation or friendly banter. Only silence, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the ticking of the great clock in the entrance hall and the occasional creak of floorboards underfoot. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something that never came. And at the center of this silent kingdom sat the master himself, Lord Sebastian Fairfax. I remember the first time I saw him. I had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain. A footman led me through the entrance hall, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors, past marble busts and cases of ancient artifacts collected by Fairfaxes long dead. We climbed the grand staircase, turned down a corridor lined with doors that seemed to stretch into infinity, and finally stopped before a study where firelight flickered against dark wood paneling. He was standing by the window when I entered, his back to me, his hands clasped behind him. He did not turn immediately, and I had a moment to observe him, to note the breadth of his shoulders beneath his perfectly tailored coat, the slight tension in his posture that suggested a man perpetually on guard against some unseen threat. When he finally turned, I found myself confronting a face that was handsome in the severe classical sense, all sharp angles and deep-set eyes the color of storm clouds. There was no warmth in those eyes, no curiosity, only a flat assessment, as though I were a piece of furniture he was considering purchasing. "You are Miss Whitmore," he said. It was not a question. "I am, my lord," I replied, dipping into the curtsy I had practiced 100 times. "I thank you for the opportunity to serve in your household." He made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been dismissal. "Mrs. Pemberton will show you to your quarters and explain your duties. You will find that I expect perfection from my staff, Miss Whitmore. I do not tolerate mistakes. I do not tolerate excuses. And I do not tolerate sentiment of any kind. Is that understood?" "Perfectly, my lord." He turned back to the window then, and I was dismissed. As I followed Mrs. Pemberton through the labyrinthine corridors to my small room in the east wing, I wondered what had happened to this man to make him so cold, so utterly devoid of human warmth. I did not yet know the answer, but I would learn it soon enough, in fragments and whispers, and the sad, knowing glances of the older servants who remembered Thornwood in happier days. Lord Fairfax was a widower. His wife, Lady Arabella, had died 3 years before my arrival, taken by a fever that swept through the county one brutal winter. The servants spoke of her with a reverence that bordered on worship, describing a woman of uncommon beauty and gentle spirit, who had filled Thornwood with music and laughter and light. Her death had extinguished something vital in Lord Fairfax. He had retreated into himself, building walls so high that no one could reach him, and he ruled his household with an iron fist because control was the only thing that made him feel safe in a world that had stolen everything he loved. I understood this, in my way. I had known loss too, but understanding did not make serving under his roof any easier. My duties at Thornwood were varied and demanding. As governess, I was responsible for managing the educational materials in the house library, organizing correspondence, and occasionally assisting with the instruction of young ladies who visited with their families during the social season. I also helped Mrs. Pemberton with administrative tasks, keeping records and ensuring that the household accounts were properly maintained. It was respectable work, work that kept my mind engaged and my hands busy, but it was lonely too. I occupied a peculiar position in the household hierarchy, neither servant nor family, belonging fully to neither world. The other servants were kind enough in their way. There was Sarah, the head housemaid, who had a quick smile and a sharper wit. There was Thomas, the young footman who blushed whenever I spoke to him. There was Cook, whose name I never learned because everyone simply called her Cook, and who ruled the kitchen with the same iron authority that Lord Fairfax exercised over the rest of the house. And there was Mr. Blackwood, the butler, a man of indeterminate age, whose face seemed carved from the same grey stone as Thornwood itself, and whose silence was so complete that one sometimes forgot he was in the room at all. I adapted. I learned the rhythms of the house, the invisible rules that governed every interaction. I learned when to speak and when to remain silent, when to offer assistance and when to melt into the shadows. I learned to navigate Lord Fairfax's moods, which shifted like weather patterns, calm one moment and stormy the next. And I learned, perhaps most importantly, to expect nothing, to want nothing, to simply exist within the confines of my role and be grateful for the roof over my head and the food on my plate. 6 months passed in this manner. 6 months of quiet routine, of measured steps and careful words, of watching the seasons change through windows I was rarely permitted to open. And then came the rain. It began on a Thursday afternoon in late March, a steady downpour that turned the gardens into rivers and the sky into a solid sheet of gray. I was in the library organizing a collection of correspondence that had accumulated over the winter, when I heard a sound that made me pause. It was faint, barely audible above the drumming of rain against glass, but unmistakable nonetheless. A whimper, a cry. I set down the letters and moved to the window. The library overlooked the east garden, a formal arrangement of hedgerows and gravel paths that Lady Arabella had designed herself, according to the servants. In better weather, it was lovely. In the rain, it looked desolate, abandoned, the hedges drooping under the weight of water and the paths turned to mud. And there, huddled beneath a stone bench near the garden wall, was a dog. My heart contracted at the sight. It was a small creature, no larger than a lady's muff, with long ears that hung limp with water and a coat that might have been white but was now gray with mud. It was shivering, its whole body trembling with cold, and even from this distance I could see how thin it was, how its ribs pressed against its sodden fur. One of its front paws was lifted slightly, as though injured, and its head hung low with exhaustion and despair. I should have turned away. I should have returned to my work and forgotten what I had seen. Lord Fairfax had made his feelings about sentiment perfectly clear, and there was no question that showing compassion to a stray animal would fall squarely into that forbidden category. The sensible thing, the safe thing, would be to close the curtain and pretend I had never looked out the window at all. But I could not do it. I could not stand there in my warm, dry library and watch a helpless creature suffer. Something in me rebelled against the very notion. Something deep and fundamental that I had carried with me since childhood, since my mother first taught me that kindness was not a luxury, but a necessity, that the measure of a person's character was how they treated those who could offer nothing in return. I made my way to the servants' entrance as quietly as I could, pausing only to grab an old cloak from the hooks by the door. It was a servant's cloak, worn and patched, nothing like the fine wool garment I had brought from home, but it was the first thing my hands found, and I did not care about appearances in that moment. All I cared about was the creature in the garden, the small life that was fading with every minute I delayed. The rain hit me like a wall when I stepped outside, cold and relentless, soaking through my clothes within seconds. The wind drove it sideways, needles of ice that stung my face and blurred my vision. I bent my head against the onslaught and pushed forward, splashing through mud that sucked at my boots, ruining them beyond repair, and soaking the hem of my dress until it clung to my legs like a sodden shroud. I did not care. None of it mattered. Only the dog mattered. I splashed through the mud, ruining my boots and the hem of my dress, until I reached the stone bench where the dog lay. The creature did not flee at my approach, as I had half expected. It simply looked up at me with eyes so full of misery and hope that my heart nearly broke. Those eyes were brown, deep, and liquid, ringed with exhaustion, but still somehow trusting. Still, somehow, believing that help might come. It was a spaniel, I realized, as I knelt beside it in the mud, heedless of my already ruined dress. A King Charles spaniel, bred for companionship and comfort, for sitting in ladies' laps and warming feet on cold winter nights. What was such a creature doing alone in the rain, far from any house or road? How had it come to be here, starving and desperate, in the gardens of an estate that must be miles from anywhere it belonged? "It is all right," I whispered, reaching out slowly so as not to frighten it. "I am going to help you. You are safe now." The dog whimpered again, a sound so small and pitiful that tears sprang unbidden to my eyes. But it did not flee. It let me gather it into my arms, let me press it against my chest and shelter it beneath my cloak. It weighed almost nothing, a bundle of wet fur and fragile bones, and as I carried it back toward the house, I made myself a promise. I would not let this creature die. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, I would not abandon it to its fate. I could not take the dog to my room. The risk was too great, the possibility of discovery too certain. Sarah came to clean my room each morning, and the other servants passed through the east wing at all hours. It would take only one person, one curious glance, to expose my secret and bring down upon me the full weight of Lord Fairfax's displeasure. Instead, I carried it to a small potting shed at the far end of the kitchen garden, a structure that had fallen into disuse since the death of the old gardener 2 winters past. It was dry inside and relatively warm, sheltered from the wind by a thick stone wall and roofed with slate tiles that kept out the worst of the rain. There was a workbench along one wall, covered with dusty pots and abandoned tools, and in the corner a pile of old burlap sacks that would serve as bedding. I settled the dog among the sacks and examined it more closely by the gray light filtering through the grimy window. It was a female, I discovered, and older than I had first thought, with gray around her muzzle and a refinement to her features that spoke of excellent breeding. Her coat, beneath the mud, was a beautiful pattern of chestnut and white, the classic markings of her breed, and her ears, when I cleaned them gently with a corner of my cloak, were like velvet beneath my fingers. And around her neck, half hidden by matted fur, was a collar of the finest leather I had ever seen, studded with what appeared to be genuine gemstones. Rubies, perhaps, or garnets, set in small gold bezels that gleamed even through the dirt. It was a collar fit for a queen, far too valuable for any ordinary pet. This was no stray. This was a lady's pet, a creature of luxury and privilege, lost or stolen from some great house. But whose? And how had she come to be in the gardens of Thornwood, half-starved and alone? I had no answers, and no time to seek them. The rain was still falling, and I was soaked to the bone, and if I did not return to the house soon, someone would notice my absence and begin asking questions. I found a cracked bowl in the corner of the shed and filled it with rainwater from a barrel outside. Then I took off my cloak, wrung out as much water as I could, and draped it over the dog to provide additional warmth. "I will come back," I promised her. "I will bring you food and proper water. Just stay here and rest. You are safe." She looked up at me with those liquid brown eyes, and I could have sworn she understood. Then I slipped out of the shed and made my way back to the house, shivering and dripping and praying that no one had seen me. Luck was with me, or so I thought. I reached my room without encountering anyone, changed into dry clothes, and returned to the library to resume my work. My hands trembled as I sorted through the correspondence, but whether from cold or fear or something else entirely, I could not say. That evening, After the household had settled into its nightly routine, I crept down to the kitchen and gathered what food I could without arousing suspicion. A few scraps of meat from the evening's roast, a heel of bread, a small piece of cheese. It was not much, but it would sustain the dog until I could find a better solution. The rain had stopped by then, and the clouds had parted to reveal a sky full of stars. I made my way to the potting shed by moonlight, my heart pounding with every step, and found the dog exactly where I had left her. She lifted her head when I entered, and her tail thumped weakly against the burlap sacks. "There you are," I said softly, kneeling beside her. "I brought you supper. Let us see if we cannot put some flesh on those bones." She ate ravenously, as I had known she would, and drank nearly all the water in the bowl. When she was finished, she pressed her head against my hand, and I stroked her ears, marveling at how soft they were despite everything she had endured. "You are a brave girl," I told her. "Whatever happened to you, whatever brought you here, you survived it. That takes courage." She looked up at me, and in her eyes I saw something that I had not seen in a very long time. Trust. Complete and unconditional trust, the kind that only the truly innocent can offer. I visited her every day after that, stealing moments whenever I could. In the gray hours before dawn, when the household still slept, I would slip from my room and make my way through the silent corridors to the kitchen garden. In the afternoon, during the brief respite between my morning duties and the evening requirements, I would find excuses to be outside, to walk past the potting shed and check on my secret charge. And at night, when the candles were extinguished and the great house fell into darkness, I would creep out once more, carrying whatever food I had managed to save from supper. I brought her food from the kitchen, careful to take only what would not be missed. A crust of bread here, a scrap of meat there, sometimes a splash of milk that I claimed had spilled when I bumped the pitcher. Cook watched me with suspicious eyes at first, but I learned to be careful, to time my visits to the kitchen when she was distracted, to take only what could plausibly have been lost to waste or accident. I brought her clean water and fresh bedding. I found an old horse blanket in the back of the stable, abandoned and forgotten, and draped it over her makeshift bed to keep out the chill of the April nights. I brushed the mud from her coat until it gleamed, working slowly and gently so as not to hurt her. And I marveled at how beautiful she was beneath the dirt, how elegant and refined. And I talked to her for hours, telling her about my life, my hopes, my fears. I told her about my parents, about the cottage in Ashworth and the apple tree in the garden. I told her about my dreams of writing, of someday putting down on paper the stories that lived inside my head. I told her about Lord Fairfax, about his coldness and his grief, about my confused feelings toward a man who seemed determined to shut out all warmth from his life. She listened with a patience that put most humans to shame. Her brown eyes would fix on my face as I spoke, her ears perked forward as though she were following every word. Sometimes she would rest her head on my lap, a gesture of trust that never failed to move me. And in her quiet company, I found a peace that I had not known since my father's death. It was strange, I thought, how a creature so small could fill so large a space in my heart. I had been alone for so long, had learned to depend on no one but myself, had convinced myself that solitude was a strength rather than a burden. But this dog, this lost and frightened creature who had wandered into my life by chance, had reminded me what it felt like to be needed, what it felt like to love without reservation, without fear, without the careful calculations that governed every other relationship in my life. I named her in my heart, though I never spoke the name aloud. I called her Hope, because that was what she had given me. Hope that kindness still mattered in a world that often seemed cruel. Hope that even in the darkest places, light could find a way to bloom. A week passed, and then another. The dog grew stronger, her ribs less prominent, her eyes brighter. She began to walk without limping, to wag her tail when she saw me coming, to greet me with the enthusiasm of a creature who had rediscovered the joy of living. I found myself counting the hours until I could see her again, rushing through my duties so that I might steal a few extra minutes in the potting shed, sitting on the cold stone floor with her head in my lap and the scent of earth and growing things all around us. Spring advanced, and with it came longer days and warmer weather. The gardens of Thornwood burst into bloom, a riot of color that seemed almost defiant against the cold gray stone of the house. I would sometimes bring Hope to the edge of the kitchen garden in the early morning, when I was certain no one would see us, and watch her explore the hedgerows with her nose to the ground, her tail wagging in pure, uncomplicated happiness. I knew that I should try to find her owner, that somewhere a lady was surely grieving the loss of her beloved companion. The collar alone suggested wealth and status far beyond anything I could imagine, and such a person would surely have the means to search for their missing pet. Perhaps there were notices posted in nearby villages, rewards offered, inquiries made. Perhaps even now, someone was weeping over the loss of this gentle creature who had become the center of my secret life. But I could not bring myself to do it. I had grown attached to this animal, had come to depend on our stolen moments together, and the thought of giving her up filled me with a sorrow I could not explain. She was mine now, or I was hers, and the bond between us felt stronger than any claim of property or ownership. I told myself that I was protecting her, that whoever had lost her had clearly not taken proper care of her, had allowed her to become lost and starving and alone. That she was better off with me, someone who loved her, someone who would never let her come to harm. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was being selfish. I was holding on to her because I needed her, because she filled a void in my life that I had not even known existed. And one day I knew that selfishness would catch up with me. I should have known that such happiness could not last. I should have known that in a house like Thornwood, where eyes were everywhere and secrets were currency, my deception would eventually be discovered. But I was careless, and I was foolish, and in the end, it was my own compassion that betrayed me. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after I had found the dog. I was carrying a basket of scraps to the potting shed, moving quickly through the kitchen garden, when I turned a corner and found myself face to face with Lord Fairfax himself. He was standing by the garden wall, examining a section of stonework that had begun to crumble. His riding coat was dusty, suggesting that he had just returned from one of his long rides across the estate. And there was a frown on his face that deepened considerably when he saw me. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice was ice. "What, precisely, are you doing?" "My lord," I began, but my voice faltered. There was no plausible explanation for my presence here, no innocent reason for a governess to be carrying a basket through the kitchen garden in the middle of the afternoon. His gaze dropped to the basket, and before I could stop him, he reached out and lifted the cloth that covered its contents. His expression shifted from suspicion to cold fury as he took in the scraps of food, the small flask of water, the clean rags I had intended to use for bedding. "Follow me," he said, and there was no room for argument in his voice. He strode toward the potting shed with the certainty of a man who already knows what he will find. I followed, my legs heavy, my heart hammering against my ribs. When he flung open the shed door and saw the dog lying among the burlap sacks, he went very still. The silence that followed was the worst kind, the kind that precedes a storm. I watched as he took in the scene, the makeshift bed, the empty bowl, the creature who lifted her head and wagged her tail in innocent greeting. And then he turned to me, and the look in his eyes was something I had never seen before, a cold rage that burned like ice. "Explain yourself," he said. "I found her in the garden, my lord. She was starving and half drowned. I could not simply leave her to die." "You could not," he repeated. "And so you have been stealing food from my kitchen, using my property to house a stray animal, and lying to my entire household for weeks. Is that correct?" "I have not lied, my lord." No one asked me. A technicality. He stepped closer, and I had to fight the urge to retreat. Do you have any idea what you have done, Miss Whitmore? Do you understand the position you have put me in? I understand that I showed compassion to a helpless creature. I do not see how that puts anyone in any position. His jaw tightened. You do not see? No, I suppose you would not. You are a governess, Miss Whitmore, a servant. Your role is to follow orders, not to make decisions based on your own sentimental impulses. I told you when you arrived that I do not tolerate sentiment. I told you that I expect perfection. And you have failed me on both counts. My lord, I began, but he cut me off. Silence. He turned away, running a hand through his hair, and for a moment I saw something flicker across his face, something that might have been pain or regret or simply exhaustion. But when he faced me again, his mask was firmly back in place. You are dismissed, Miss Whitmore, effective immediately. The words hit me like a physical blow. Dismissed. After 6 months of careful service, after countless hours of hard work and quiet dedication, I was being cast out because I had fed a starving dog. My lord, please, I said, and I hated the tremor in my voice, hated the desperation that I could not quite conceal. I have nowhere to go. If you dismiss me without a reference, I will never find another position. I will be ruined. You should have thought of that before you decided to disobey my explicit instructions. I disobeyed nothing. You never forbade me from showing kindness to an animal. His eyes flashed. Do not play word games with me, Miss Whitmore. You knew perfectly well that your actions would not be sanctioned. You chose to deceive me, and now you must face the consequences. I stared at him, searching for some sign of mercy, some crack in his armor through which I might appeal to whatever humanity remained within him. But there was nothing, only cold, implacable stone. Very well, my lord, I said quietly. I will gather my things. You have 1 hour. He gestured to the dog. And take that creature with you. I will not have it on my property. I wanted to argue. I wanted to rage against the injustice of it all, to remind him that compassion was not a crime, that showing mercy to a helpless creature did not make me a thief or a liar or any of the other things his cold eyes seemed to accuse me of being. But what would be the point? He had made his decision, and nothing I said would change it. I gathered the dog into my arms and walked past him without another word. I could feel his gaze on my back as I crossed the kitchen garden, heavy and unrelenting, but I did not turn around. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing my tears. 1 hour. 1 hour to pack 6 months of my life into a single carpet bag, to say goodbye to the servants who had become something like friends, to steel myself for the uncertain future that awaited me beyond Thornwood's gates. It was not enough time, but then again, it never would have been. A lifetime would not have been enough to process what had just happened, to come to terms with the destruction of everything I had worked so hard to build. I moved through my room in a daze, my hands performing the familiar motions of packing, while my mind struggled to comprehend the magnitude of my fall. 6 months ago, I had arrived at Thornwood with such hope, such determination to prove myself worthy of this opportunity. I had worked harder than I had ever worked in my life, had given everything I had to this position, had done everything right except for one single act of compassion that had cost me everything. Sarah found me in my room, folding my few dresses with hands that would not stop shaking. She had heard what happened, of course. The news had spread through the servants' quarters like wildfire, and her eyes were red-rimmed with sympathetic tears. She stood in the doorway for a moment, as though afraid to enter, and then she crossed to where I stood and pulled me into an embrace that nearly broke what remained of my composure. "It is not fair," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It is not right. You did nothing wrong, Cecily. You showed kindness. How can that be a crime?" "It is not a crime," I replied, my voice muffled against her shoulder. "But it is a breach of his rules, and in this house, that amounts to the same thing. She pulled back, holding me at arm's length, and I saw the fury in her eyes, the indignation on my behalf that I was too numb to feel for myself. "He is a monster," she said, "a cold, heartless monster. I have worked in this house for 5 years, and I have never seen him show a moment of warmth to anyone. Not to the servants, not to his neighbors, not even to himself. He sits alone in that study of his, staring at nothing, and he calls it living. But it is not living, Cecily. It is dying, slowly, day by day, and he wants everyone around him to die with him." I shook my head, though I was not certain what I was denying. "Whatever he is," I said, "it does not matter now. What matters is where I will go, what I will do. I have a cousin in London. Perhaps she will take me in until I can find another position. Without a reference?" I had no answer to that. We both knew what dismissal without a reference meant. It meant closed doors and suspicious looks and a slow descent into poverty. It meant begging for work that no respectable establishment would offer, taking positions that would strip away what remained of my dignity. It meant the workhouse, eventually, or worse. The silence between us was heavy with all the things we could not say. Then Sarah reached into her pocket and pressed something into my hand. A few coins, more than she could afford to spare. "I cannot take this," I said, trying to give them back. "You need this money. You have family to support." She closed my fingers around the coins and held them there. "You are my family too," she said. "Or you have been these past months. Take it, please. It is all I can do." Tears spilled down my cheeks then, the dam finally breaking. I pulled her close again and wept against her shoulder, mourning not just my position, but the connections I had made here, the friendships that had sustained me through the lonely days and nights. I wept for the dog I had saved, who would now be cast out into the world with me, neither of us knowing where we would find shelter. I wept for the life I had imagined for myself, the future that had seemed so certain only this morning and now lay in ruins at my feet. Sarah held me until the tears subsided, murmuring words of comfort that I could barely hear. Then she helped me finish packing, folding my clothes with the care of a mother preparing her daughter for a long journey. When my carpetbag was full and my room stripped of any trace of my presence, we stood together in the doorway, neither of us willing to take the first step toward goodbye. "I will pray for you," she said, her voice cracking. "And I will write to you if you send me your direction. You have been a good friend to me, Cecily Whitmore. I will not forget you." I squeezed her hand, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. Then I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and made my way downstairs with Hope cradled in my arms and my carpetbag hanging heavy from my shoulder. The servants had gathered in the entrance hall to see me off, a silent audience to my disgrace. I saw their faces as I descended the great staircase, the sympathy and the sorrow, and, in some cases, the careful blankness of those who feared to show too much emotion lest they draw the master's attention to themselves. Mrs. Pemberton's face was carefully blank, but I thought I saw something like sympathy in her eyes, a flicker of humanity beneath the professional mask she wore. Thomas, the footman, pressed a small purse into my hand as I passed, his blush deeper than ever, his eyes fixed on the floor. Even Mr. Blackwood, the impassive butler, inclined his head in what might have been a gesture of respect, and that small acknowledgement meant more to me than I could say. Cook was there too, standing at the back of the assembly with her arms crossed over her substantial bosom. She did not speak, but when our eyes met, she gave me a single, firm nod, as though to say that she understood, that she did not blame me, that in her place she might have done the same. I walked out through the great oak doors of Thornwood Manor, and they closed behind me with a sound like a coffin lid. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and the air was thick with the scent of spring flowers. Birds sang in the ancient oaks that lined the drive, their voices bright and cheerful, utterly indifferent to my despair. It should have been beautiful. It felt like a funeral. I had nowhere to go. I walked. That was all I could think to do. I walked down the long drive that led from Thornwood to the village road, my carpetbag growing heavier with every step, the dog a warm weight against my chest. The gravel crunched beneath my boots, and the shadows lengthened as the sun continued its descent. And still I walked, one foot in front of the other, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant confronting the enormity of what had happened. I walked as the sun set and the first stars appeared, pinpricks of light against the darkening sky. I walked as the temperature dropped, and my breath began to fog in the cooling air, as the familiar landmarks of the estate gave way to the open road and the distant silhouettes of village rooftops. I walked because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant confronting the enormity of what had happened, the absolute ruin of everything I had worked so hard to build. The dog, Hope, seemed to sense my distress. She pressed closer to my chest, her small body warm against my heart, and occasionally she would lift her head to look up at me with those liquid brown eyes, as though to remind me that I was not entirely alone. Whatever happened, whatever the future held, we would face it together. The thought was a small comfort, but in that moment, it was enough. There was an inn in the village, the Rose and Crown, where I had sometimes stopped for a cup of tea on my half-days. It was a modest establishment, clean and respectable, the sort of place where a woman alone might find shelter without fear of impropriety. I made my way there now, my legs aching and my heart heavy, hoping that the few coins in my pocket would be enough for a night's lodging. I would figure out the rest in the morning. I would write to my cousin. I would find a way forward. I had to believe that, or I would collapse right there in the middle of the road and never get up again. The village was quiet when I arrived. Most of its residents already retired behind closed doors. Lamplight flickered in windows, warm and golden, and I felt a pang of longing for the simple comforts of home, for the security I had known as a child before the world had stripped it away. I quickened my pace, the inn now visible at the end of the main street, its sign creaking gently in the evening breeze. The innkeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Doyle, clucked her tongue sympathetically when she saw me. She had heard what happened, of course. News traveled fast in small villages, and while she could not openly criticize Lord Fairfax, her disapproval was evident in every gesture, every word. She ushered me inside with a warmth that brought fresh tears to my eyes, settling me in a chair by the fire and pressing a cup of hot tea into my trembling hands. "Such a shame," she said, shaking her head. "Such a terrible shame. You did nothing wrong, Miss Whitmore. Everyone in the village is saying so. That man has no heart at all." I could not speak, could only nod and sip my tea and try to hold myself together. Mrs. Doyle seemed to understand. She left me alone for a few minutes, and when she returned, she was carrying a key and a basket covered with a cloth napkin. "I have given you our best room," she said. "It is not much, but it is clean and warm, and there is a lock on the door. And this," she added, lifting the cloth to reveal a bowl of hot soup and a thick slice of bread, "is for you. You look as though you have not eaten all day." "You are too kind," I managed. "I do not know how I will repay you." She waved away my words. "You will repay me by getting some rest and not worrying yourself into an early grave. Tomorrow is another day, Miss Whitmore. Things always look brighter in the morning." She led me upstairs to a small but comfortable room at the back of the inn. There was a bed with clean sheets, a washstand with a pitcher of fresh water, and a window that looked out over the inn's modest garden. It was simple, far simpler than my room at Thornwood had been, but it felt safe in a way that Thornwood never had. I thanked Mrs. Doyle again, more effusively than the situation perhaps warranted, and she patted my shoulder before leaving me to my solitude. I sat on the edge of the bed. Hope curled beside me and stared at the wall. The soup grew cold in its bowl. The candle Mrs. Doyle had left burned low. And still I sat, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything but exist in the wreckage of my former life. I lay in the narrow bed that night, the dog curled against my side, and stared at the ceiling. The plaster was cracked in places, forming patterns that might have been faces or clouds or nothing at all. I traced them with my eyes, my mind too exhausted for true thought, floating somewhere between waking and sleeping. I did not cry. I had cried enough on the walk to the village, had wept until my eyes were swollen and my throat raw, and now I felt empty, hollowed out, as though all my emotions had been scraped away and nothing remained but a dull, persistent ache. It was not numbness exactly. It was something deeper, something more final. The feeling of having come to the end of a road and finding nothing there. Tomorrow, I told myself, my lips moving silently in the darkness. Tomorrow, I would begin again. Tomorrow, I would find a way. But the words felt hollow, even to me. And as sleep finally claimed me, I wondered if I would ever feel whole again. But tomorrow brought something that no one, least of all me, could ever have predicted. I was woken by a commotion downstairs, raised voices and the clatter of horses' hooves, and a general air of chaos that seemed completely out of place in the quiet little inn. At first, in my half-dreaming state, I thought I must be imagining it. The Rose and Crown was not the sort of establishment that attracted commotion. Its clientele was modest, its atmosphere peaceful, its greatest excitement usually the arrival of the weekly mail coach. But the noise continued, growing louder, and Hope lifted her head from the pillow beside me, her ears pricked with curiosity. I pushed myself upright, blinking in the gray morning light that filtered through the thin curtains, and tried to make sense of what I was hearing. There were voices, many voices, speaking in tones that ranged from urgent to deferential. There was the jingle of harnesses and the stamp of hooves on cobblestones. And underneath it all, a strange, electric energy that seemed to pulse through the very walls of the inn. I dressed quickly, my fingers fumbling with buttons and laces, and made my way to the door with Hope at my heels. The corridor was empty, but I could hear Mrs. Doyle's voice rising from the common room below, pitched higher than usual and threaded with an emotion I could not quite identify. Excitement? Fear? Awe? I descended the stairs, my hand trailing along the worn banister, and stopped dead at the bottom. The common room was full of people, more people than I had ever seen in the Rose and Crown at one time. There were men in livery, servants by the look of them, but livery of a kind I did not recognize, finer than anything worn at Thornwood or any other great house I had ever seen. The fabric was rich and dark, embroidered with what appeared to be gold thread, and the buttons gleamed like small suns. There were ladies in traveling cloaks, their faces pinched with worry and their hands clasped before them in attitudes of anxious prayer. And standing near the door, alert and watchful, were several men who could only be guards, their postures rigid and their eyes scanning the room with professional vigilance. And at the center of it all, seated in Mrs. Doyle's best chair with a cup of tea in her hand, was a woman who needed no introduction. I had never seen Queen Victoria in person, but I had seen enough portraits to recognize her instantly. She was smaller than I had expected, and older, her face lined with the weight of her years and her responsibilities. Her hair, mostly gray now, was pulled back beneath a simple bonnet, and her dress, while fine, was less ornate than I would have imagined for the monarch of the British Empire. But there was an unmistakable authority in her bearing, a quiet power that commanded attention even when she sat perfectly still. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, swept the room with a gaze that missed nothing, and her presence seemed to fill the space in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. I froze in the doorway, suddenly aware of my rumpled dress and disheveled hair, the dog still clutched in my arms and my mouth hanging open like a country simpleton. This could not be happening. The Queen of England could not possibly be sitting in the common room of a village inn in Hampshire, drinking tea and looking as though she belonged there. But she was, and more than that, she was looking directly at me. Or rather, she was looking at the dog. Her expression changed in an instant. The regal composure cracked, replaced by something raw and human and utterly unexpected. Her eyes widened. Her teacup clattered against its saucer, tea splashing over the rim and staining the white linen beneath. And then she was on her feet, crossing the room with a speed that belied her age, her hands outstretched toward the creature in my arms. "Dash," she breathed, and her voice was trembling. "Oh, my darling Dash, is it really you?" The dog, Dash apparently, went wild. She squirmed in my arms, her tail wagging so hard that her whole body shook and let out a series of joyful barks that echoed through the room like bells. I released her instinctively, and she leapt into the Queen's arms, covering her face with kisses, whimpering and barking and wriggling with a joy that seemed almost too large for her small body to contain. And the Queen of England, the Empress of India, the most powerful woman in the world, knelt on the floor of a village inn and wept into the fur of a small spaniel as though her heart would break. I stood there in stunned silence, watching the scene unfold before me like something out of a dream. The assembled servants watched too, their expressions ranging from relief to disbelief to undisguised tears. Even the guards seemed moved, their professional stoicism cracking at the edges as they witnessed their sovereign's reunion with her beloved pet. "We have been searching for weeks," one of the ladies-in-waiting said, stepping forward to address me. Her Royal Majesty was visiting the area when Dash escaped from her carriage. We have had search parties combing the countryside, offering rewards, questioning everyone we could find. "How on earth did you come to have her?" "I found her," I managed to say, "in the gardens at Thornwood Manor, where I was employed as a governess. She was starving and half drowned. I could not leave her to die." The Queen looked up at that, her eyes meeting mine for the first time. She had Dash pressed against her chest, and her face was still wet with tears. But there was a sharpness in her gaze that reminded me exactly who I was speaking to. "You cared for my dog," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Majesty. For how long?" 3 weeks, Your Majesty. I fed her and gave her water and kept her warm. I did not know who she belonged to. I thought perhaps if I nursed her back to health, I could find her owner. And where is this Thornwood Manor? Why are you here, in this inn, rather than there?" I hesitated. The truth was humiliating, and I was not certain I wanted to share it with the Queen of England. But those sharp eyes demanded honesty, and I found that I could not lie to her. "I was dismissed, Your Majesty. Yesterday, Lord Fairfax discovered that I had been caring for the dog, and he accused me of theft and deception. He turned me out without a reference." A murmur ran through the room. The Queen's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been anger or might have been curiosity. "He dismissed you for saving my dog's life," she said. "Yes, Your Majesty." She was silent for a long moment, her hand moving absently over Dash's fur. Then she turned to one of her attendants, a tall man in the finest livery I had ever seen, and issued a command that sent my head spinning. "Send word to Thornwood Manor," she said. "Tell Lord Fairfax that the Queen requests his presence. Immediately." The next few hours passed in a blur. I was given a room at the inn, a proper room with clean sheets and a fire in the grate, and a lady's maid was sent to help me bathe and dress. Someone produced a gown that fit me reasonably well, a simple thing of dark blue wool, but finer than anything I had ever worn. I was fed a proper breakfast and given tea, and through it all, I kept waiting for someone to tell me that this was a dream, that I was still lying in my narrow bed at Thornwood, that none of this was real. But it was real, all of it. The Queen of England was in the village inn, and she had sent for Lord Fairfax. And I, Cecily Whitmore, dismissed governess, was somehow at the center of it all. Lord Fairfax arrived at midday. I heard his carriage before I saw it, the thunder of hooves and the creak of wheels announcing his approach like a herald. I was in the common room when he entered, standing by the window because I could not bear to sit, and I watched his face as he took in the scene before him. He was pale. That was the first thing I noticed. Pale and tense, his usual composure cracked by what must have been the shock of his life. He had dressed carefully, as one does when summoned by royalty, but there was a wildness in his eyes that suggested he had not slept, that he had spent the night pacing his study and wondering what disaster had befallen him now. When he saw me, standing there in my borrowed gown with my hands clasped before me, something passed over his face that I could not quite read. Surprise, certainly. But something else too, something deeper and more complicated. Then the Queen entered, and all attention shifted to her. "Lord Fairfax," she said, and her voice was polite but cool. "Thank you for coming so quickly. Your Majesty." He bowed low, lower than I had ever seen him bow. "It is my honor to serve you." "Indeed." She settled into her chair, Dash curled in her lap, and fixed him with a gaze that could have cut glass. "I understand that you recently dismissed a member of your household, a Miss Cecily Whitmore." He stiffened. "I did, Your Majesty. And the reason for this dismissal?" "She violated my trust, Your Majesty. She deceived me and my household for weeks, using my resources without permission." The Queen raised an eyebrow, the resources in question being food scraps and a disused potting shed. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "Yes, Your Majesty, food scraps and a potting shed that she used to save the life of my beloved companion, the dog I have had since she was a puppy, the dog who has been my constant comfort through the darkest years of my reign. That dog, Lord Fairfax." There was nothing he could say to that. I watched him struggle, watched him search for words that would salvage the situation, and found none. His face was a mask of controlled humiliation, and for a single unworthy moment I felt a flicker of satisfaction, but only a flicker. Beneath the satisfaction was something else, something unexpected. Pity. Because I saw in that moment what this confrontation was costing him. His pride, his dignity, his carefully constructed walls, all of it crumbling under the weight of the Queen's displeasure. "Miss Whitmore," the Queen said, turning to me, "I understand that you were dismissed without a reference. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Majesty. And do you know what that means?" "What fate awaits a woman of your station without a reference to secure future employment?" "I believe I do, Your Majesty." She nodded slowly. "Then you will understand the gravity of what Lord Fairfax has done. Not only did he punish you for an act of extraordinary kindness, but he condemned you to poverty and disgrace, for feeding a hungry dog, for showing compassion to a creature in need." "Your Majesty," Lord Fairfax began, but she silenced him with a look. "I am not finished." She stroked Dash's ears, her expression thoughtful. "I have been Queen of this nation for 50 years, Lord Fairfax. I have seen empires rise and fall. I have buried a husband and borne 9 children. I have weathered scandals and wars and losses that would break a lesser soul. And do you know what I have learned in all that time?" He shook his head, mute. "I have learned that kindness is the rarest and most precious quality a person can possess. It is easy to be cruel. It is easy to be cold. But to be kind, truly kind, to show mercy to those who cannot repay it, that requires a strength of character that most people never achieve." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Miss Whitmore possesses that strength. You, it seems, do not." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the blood rushing in my ears. Lord Fairfax stood before the Queen of England, stripped of his armor, exposed in all his imperfection, and I found that I could not look away. "I will not interfere with the management of your household," the Queen continued. "That is not my place. But I will tell you this, Lord Fairfax, cruelty has a price, coldness has a cost. And if you continue on your current path, you will find yourself alone in that great house of yours, surrounded by servants who fear you and peers who pity you, with nothing to keep you warm but your pride." She rose then, cradling Dash in her arms, and turned to me. "Miss Whitmore, I would like to offer you a position in my household. As a lady's companion, if that would suit you. You would have comfortable quarters, a generous salary, and the gratitude of a queen. What do you say?" I opened my mouth to accept. It was everything I could have hoped for, more than I had ever dared to dream. A position in the royal household, security and comfort and respect, all offered freely by the most powerful woman in the world. But something stopped me. Some instinct, some whisper of intuition that I could not quite identify. I looked at Lord Fairfax, at his pale face and his clenched fists and his eyes that burned with a pain I was only beginning to understand. And I heard myself say something that surprised us both. "Your Majesty, I am deeply honored by your offer, but if I might have a day to consider it, I would be most grateful." The Queen studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled, a small, knowing smile that suggested she understood far more than she was saying. "Of course," she said. "Take all the time you need. I will be in the area for another week. You may send your answer to me at Hartwell House." And then she was gone, sweeping out of the inn with her entourage in tow, leaving me alone with Lord Fairfax in the sudden silence. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, neither of us speaking, neither of us moving. The fire crackled in the grate, the clock on the mantel ticked, and still we stood, two people caught in the wreckage of their own making. "Why," he said finally, and his voice was rough, unsteady, "why did you not accept?" "I do not know," I admitted. It was the truth. I did not know why I had hesitated, did not understand the impulse that had made me delay. He shook his head slowly, as if trying to clear it. "She offered you everything, safety, comfort, a future, and you asked for time to consider. I did, because of me. It was not a question, but I answered anyway. Perhaps." He laughed then, a hollow, broken sound. "You are either the wisest woman I have ever met, Miss Whitmore, or the most foolish. I suspect I am neither, my lord. I am simply a woman who has learned that not all decisions should be made in haste." He was silent again, his eyes fixed on some point beyond my shoulder. Then, so quietly that I almost missed it, he said, "I was wrong. My lord, I was wrong to dismiss you. I was wrong to punish you for showing kindness. I was wrong about everything." The words hung in the air between us, fragile and unexpected. I had thought Lord Fairfax incapable of admitting fault. I had thought him too proud, too cold, too locked away within himself to ever acknowledge his mistakes. But here he was, standing before me with his defenses in ruins, offering me something that might have been an apology. "Why?" I asked, and my voice was gentler than I had intended. "Why were you so angry?" "It was just a dog, my lord. It was just a small act of kindness." He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were wet. "Because kindness is dangerous," he said. "Because it opens doors that should remain closed. Because once you start caring, once you start letting yourself feel, you become vulnerable to loss. And I have had enough loss to last a lifetime. I understood then. I understood everything. The coldness, the cruelty, the iron walls he had built around his heart. It was not strength, it was fear. Fear of loving and losing, of opening himself up only to be destroyed all over again." "Lady Arabella," I said softly. He flinched at the name. "My wife had a dog. Did you know that? A spaniel, just like the one you found. She loved that creature more than anything in the world. When she died, the dog pined for her. It stopped eating, stopped playing, stopped doing anything but lying by her grave. Within a month, it was dead too. I did not know that, my lord. When I saw you with that animal, when I realized what you had been doing, I felt something I had not felt in 3 years. Something I thought I had killed, and it terrified me. What did you feel?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, and his eyes held none of the coldness I had come to expect. Only pain. Only truth. "Hope," he said. I felt hope, and I could not bear it. I do not know what possessed me to do what I did next. Perhaps it was the raw vulnerability in his voice. Perhaps it was my own exhaustion, my own longing for connection after so many months of careful distance. Or perhaps it was simply the knowledge that this man, this cold, proud, impossible man, was not so different from me after all. I crossed the distance between us and took his hand. He stiffened at my touch, but he did not pull away. His hand was warm in mine, large and strong and trembling slightly, and when I looked up into his face, I saw something I had never seen there before. Wonder. "Hope is not the enemy, my lord," I said. "It is what keeps us alive. It is what makes us human. How can you say that? After everything I have done to you, after the way I treated you, how can you stand there and offer me comfort? Because kindness is not a weakness. It is a choice. And I choose to believe that people can change, that hearts can heal, that even the coldest winter eventually gives way to spring." He stared at me as though I were speaking a language he had never heard before. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension in his shoulders began to ease. "You should accept the Queen's offer," he said. "It is more than I could ever give you." "Perhaps," I replied. "But perhaps I do not want what the Queen can give. Then what do you want?" I considered the question carefully. What did I want? Security, certainly. Comfort. A roof over my head and food on my plate. But there was something else too, something I had not allowed myself to acknowledge until this very moment. "I want to be seen," I said. "Not as a servant or a governess or a charity case. Not as someone to be pitied or feared or dismissed. I want to be seen as I am, with all my flaws and my hopes and my stubborn, foolish kindness. And I want to see others the same way." His grip on my hand tightened. "And if I promised to try? If I told you that I would spend the rest of my days learning to see you, really see you, would you stay?" My heart was pounding so hard, I was certain he could hear it. This was madness. This was impossible. This was the furthest thing from proper that I could imagine. But it was also the most honest moment of my life. "I cannot make such a promise lightly, my lord," I said. "You hurt me. You cast me out without a second thought. How can I trust that you will not do so again?" "You cannot," he admitted. "Not yet, but I am asking for the chance to prove myself. I am asking for time." "Time," I repeated. "That seems to be in great demand today." A ghost of a smile crossed his face, the first I had ever seen there. "So it does." "Then let me offer you this, Miss Whitmore. Return to Thornwood. Not as a servant, but as a guest. Stay for a month, or 2, or however long you need. Let me show you that I am capable of change. And at the end of that time, if you still wish to leave, if you still find me wanting, I will write you the finest reference any governess has ever received and send you to the Queen's household with my blessing." It was a fair offer, more than fair, given everything that had happened. And yet I hesitated. "Why?" I asked again. "Why does it matter to you whether I stay or go?" He was silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice so quiet I had to lean closer to hear him, he said, "Because you are the first person in 3 years who has made me feel alive. Because when I look at you, I see everything I have been too afraid to want. Because you fed a starving dog in the rain, and in doing so, you showed me what courage really looks like." I felt tears prick at my eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. I blinked them back, but not before one escaped and traced a warm path down my cheek. "Very well, my lord," I said. "I will stay." The weeks that followed were unlike anything I could have imagined. True to his word, Lord Fairfax gave me rooms in the main house, comfortable and well-appointed, with a view of the gardens I had once crept through in secret. The rooms were in the west wing, far from the servants' quarters, but close to the family apartments, a placement that spoke volumes about my new status in the household. There was a sitting room with tall windows that let in the afternoon light, A bedroom with a four-poster bed hung with velvet curtains, and a small dressing room where a maid came each morning to help me with my toilette. I was introduced to the household staff not as a servant, but as a guest of the family, a distinction that caused no small amount of confusion among those who had witnessed my ignominious departure. I saw the questions in their eyes, the curiosity they did not dare voice, and I understood their bewilderment. I was bewildered myself. Less than a week ago, I had been a governess, dismissed in disgrace. Now I was a guest, treated with a deference that felt strange and uncomfortable, like wearing a gown that did not quite fit. But if the servants were confused, they were also kind. Sarah embraced me when she saw me, tears streaming down her face, her joy at my return so genuine that it brought tears to my own eyes. She peppered me with questions, wanting to know everything that had happened, everything I had felt, and I told her what I could, though some of it was still too raw, too uncertain to put into words. Cook prepared all my favorite dishes without being asked, appearing at my door with trays of delicacies that she claimed were merely leftovers from the main kitchen. I knew better, of course. I recognized the extra effort, the special touches that marked these meals as something more than ordinary fare. And when I tried to thank her, she waved away my words with a gruff noise that might have been embarrassment. Even Mrs. Pemberton, that paragon of propriety, allowed herself a small, approving nod when we passed in the corridors. I thought I saw the ghost of a smile on her thin lips once. Though it vanished so quickly, I could not be certain it had been there at all. And Lord Fairfax himself began to change. It did not happen all at once. The walls he had built over 3 years of grief could not be dismantled in a day. There were mornings when I saw the old coldness in his eyes, the familiar distance that kept the world at arm's length. There were moments when he retreated into silence, his face shuttered and his thoughts unreadable. But these episodes grew less frequent as the days passed, and between them, I began to see glimpses of the man he might have been, the man he might still become. He sought out my company at meals, taking his breakfast in the small morning room instead of alone in his study, engaging me in conversation about books and philosophy and the state of the world beyond Thornwood's gates. He asked my opinions and actually listened to my answers, his brow furrowed in concentration as I spoke, his questions thoughtful and probing. It was a novel experience being taken seriously by a man of his station, and I found myself rising to the challenge, articulating thoughts I had never shared with anyone. He showed me the gardens that Lady Arabella had designed, walking beside me through the hedgerows and flower beds, speaking of her now with sadness rather than bitter silence. He told me how she had spent years planning each section, choosing plants that would bloom in succession so that there was always color, always life. He showed me her favorite bench, tucked away in a corner of the rose garden where she had liked to sit and read on summer afternoons. And he did not flinch when I reached out to touch his arm in comfort, did not pull away from the simple human contact that he had denied himself for so long. He laughed, actually laughed, at something Thomas said one afternoon, a comment about a wayward chicken that had somehow found its way into the formal dining room. The sound was so unexpected that several servants dropped what they were holding, their faces slack with shock. It was not a large laugh, not a full-bodied expression of mirth, but it was real. It was genuine, and it transformed his face in ways that took my breath away. I found myself looking forward to our conversations with an eagerness that surprised me. I found myself thinking about him at odd moments, wondering what he was doing, whether he was reading or riding, or simply standing by the window, gazing out at the gardens his wife had planted. I found myself noticing things I had never noticed before, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the deep timbre of his voice when he spoke softly, the rare but beautiful smile that occasionally crossed his face. He was trying. That was what mattered. He was trying, and it was working. And every day I felt my own defenses crumble a little more. We walked together most afternoons when the weather permitted. He showed me parts of the estate I had never seen. Hidden meadows and ancient ruins and a waterfall that tumbled down a rocky hillside into a pool so clear that you could see every pebble on the bottom. He told me stories of his childhood here, of games played with siblings long since scattered to their own estates, of lessons learned and mischief caused, and a time when Thornwood had been filled with warmth and laughter. And I told him about my own childhood, about the cottage in Ashworth and my parents and the dreams I had once cherished. I told him about my mother's sewing and my father's farm, about the books I had devoured and the stories I had written in secret, filling notebook after notebook with tales of adventure and romance. I had never shared these things with anyone, had kept them locked away like treasures, too precious to risk. But with him, in the golden light of those spring afternoons, the words came easily, flowing like water from a spring. Something was growing between us, something fragile and tentative, like the first shoots of a plant emerging from winter soil. Neither of us named it. Neither of us acknowledged it directly. But it was there, in the glances that lingered a moment too long, in the accidental touches that sent electricity through my veins, in the conversations that stretched late into the evening because neither of us wanted them to end. It was during this time that the Queen sent word. She would be leaving the area soon, and she wanted to know my decision. Would I join her household, or had I chosen another path? I sat with her letter for a long time, reading and rereading the words, weighing my options. The Queen's offer was still extraordinary, still more than I had any right to expect. But when I thought about accepting it, about leaving Thornwood and Lord Fairfax and the strange, fragile thing that was growing between us, something in my chest tightened in protest. I wrote my reply that evening. I thanked Her Majesty for her generosity and her kindness, and I told her that I had found a reason to stay where I was. I did not explain what that reason was. I suspect she already knew. A month passed, then 2, and then one evening, Lord Fairfax found me in the library, curled up in a chair by the fire with a book in my lap. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice was formal, but his eyes were warm. "Might I have a word?" "Of course, my lord." He crossed to the window and stood there for a moment, gazing out at the moonlit gardens. When he spoke again, his voice was unsteady. "I have been thinking about what you said, about wanting to be seen, about choosing kindness even when it is difficult." "Yes?" He turned to face me. "I have spent 3 years punishing myself for my wife's death. I told myself that if I had loved her less, it would not have hurt so much when I lost her. I told myself that the safest course was to feel nothing at all. But that was a lie, Miss Whitmore. A lie I told myself because the truth was too painful to bear. What is the truth, my lord? The truth is that love is worth the risk. The truth is that I would rather feel everything, joy and sorrow and hope and fear, than spend another day behind these walls, alone with my grief." He crossed to where I sat and knelt before me, taking my hands in his. "I know I have no right to ask this," he said. "I know I have done nothing to deserve your regard. But Miss Whitmore, Cecily, if you would give me the chance, I would like to try. I would like to love you if you will let me. Not as a master loves a servant, but as an equal, as a partner, as the extraordinary woman you are." I looked down at him, this man who had been my tormentor and my salvation, my enemy and my hope, and I saw at last the person he truly was. Not the cold lord of the manor, not the grief-stricken widower, but simply Sebastian, a man who had lost everything and was trying, however imperfectly, to find his way back to the light. "I believe," I said softly, "that I would like that very much." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after a long, dark night. He rose and drew me to my feet, and for a moment we simply stood there, hands clasped, hearts open, 2 people on the threshold of something new. "I am not an easy man," he warned. "I am stubborn and proud, and I have more flaws than I can count." "I am aware," I replied, "and yet I find myself undeterred." He laughed then, that same warm, surprised laugh I had heard weeks ago, and pulled me into his arms. It was not proper. It was not what a lady should allow. But in that moment, with the fire crackling behind us and the moon rising over the gardens Lady Arabella had planted, propriety seemed like the smallest of concerns. "I love you," he murmured against my hair. "I did not think it was possible, but I do. I love your kindness and your courage and the way you refuse to give up on anyone, even when they have given you every reason to do so." "I love you too," I whispered back. And I did. Against all odds, against all reason, I loved this impossible man with a fierceness that surprised even me. We were married in the spring, in the same chapel where Sebastian had wed Arabella years before. It was a small ceremony, just the household staff and a few close friends, but it was perfect in ways that grand celebrations rarely achieve. The stone walls of the chapel were softened by garlands of spring flowers, roses and lilies, and the tiny blue forget-me-nots that grew wild in the meadows around Thornwood. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colors across the stone floor, painting us in shades of ruby and sapphire and gold as we stood before the altar. I wore a gown of ivory silk, simpler than fashion dictated, but more beautiful to me than any elaborate confection could have been. Sarah had helped me dress that morning, her hands trembling with emotion as she fastened the row of tiny buttons that ran down my back. She had wept, of course, tears of joy that she did not try to hide, and I had wept with her, two women marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Sebastian stood at the altar as I walked down the aisle, his face more open than I had ever seen it, his eyes bright with an emotion that needed no words to express. He was handsome in his formal attire, but it was not his appearance that struck me as I approached. It was the expression he wore, the look of a man who has found something he never expected to find, something he had stopped believing in long ago. When the vicar asked if he would take me as his wife, his voice did not waver. When he slipped the ring onto my finger, a simple band of gold that had belonged to his grandmother, I saw tears in his eyes that he did not try to hide. And when he kissed me, sealing our vows with a tenderness that made my heart ache, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. The household celebrated with us. Cook had prepared a feast that would have done credit to any noble wedding, and the servants danced and laughed and toasted our happiness with a sincerity that moved me deeply. These people who had watched our story unfold, who had witnessed the darkness and the struggle and the slow, painful emergence into light, rejoiced with us now, their faces bright with hope. Even Mrs. Pemberton unbent enough to offer me a genuine smile and a brief embrace, her thin arms surprisingly strong as they wrapped around me. "I have been in service for 40 years, she said quietly, so that only I could hear. "I have seen many marriages, but I have never seen two people more suited to each other than you and Lord Fairfax. May God bless your union, Lady Fairfax." Lady Fairfax. The title felt strange on my tongue, foreign and unfamiliar. But when Sebastian took my hand and led me out of the chapel into the spring sunshine, when he looked at me with those gray eyes that had once seemed so cold and now held only warmth, the title began to feel less like a costume and more like a truth. The Queen sent a gift, a beautiful silver collar for the dog we had adopted, a King Charles spaniel we named Hope. She had returned Dash to her royal household, of course, but before leaving the area, she had arranged for us to receive one of Dash's relatives, a young spaniel with the same chestnut and white markings and the same gentle temperament. The Queen's note read simply, "I told you kindness was a strength. May it serve you well in the years to come. And I have sent you a companion to remind you always of how your story began." Hope settled into life at Thornwood as though she had always belonged there. She followed me through the corridors, slept at the foot of our bed, and greeted Sebastian each evening with the enthusiasm of a creature who had never known anything but love. She was, in her small way, a symbol of everything we had built together. A living reminder that compassion was never wasted, that love could grow from the most unlikely beginnings. Those years were not always easy. We had our struggles, as all couples do. Sebastian's grief did not disappear overnight, and there were days when the walls threatened to rise again, when the old coldness crept back into his eyes. But we faced those days together, hand in hand, and each time we emerged a little stronger, a little more certain of the bond between us. I think often of that rainy afternoon when I found a starving dog in the garden and made a choice that changed everything. I think of the woman I was then, afraid and uncertain, standing at the crossroads of her life without knowing which path to take. And I marvel at how far I have come, how much I have grown, how completely my world has been transformed by a single act of compassion. Kindness is not a weakness. It is not a flaw or a failing or a thing to be ashamed of. It is the most powerful force in the world, the spark that lights the darkness, the hand that reaches out across the void. I know this now, with a certainty that goes deeper than bone. And if I could go back, if I could stand once again in that rain-soaked garden with a shivering dog in my arms, I would make the same choice without hesitation. Because kindness is always worth the risk. Love is always worth the pain. And the greatest rewards in life come to those who are brave enough to open their hearts, even when every instinct tells them to keep them closed. I am Cecily Fairfax, once Whitmore, and this is my story. A story of loss and love, of cruelty and compassion, of a queen and a spaniel and a cold-hearted lord who learned at last to feel. It is not a perfect story, but it is mine, and I would not trade it for all the world. The years that followed our wedding unfolded like the pages of a novel I had never dared to write for myself. Thornwood, which had once seemed so cold and forbidding, became a home filled with warmth and laughter. Sebastian threw open the windows that had been shuttered for 3 years, let the spring air sweep through the corridors, and invited neighbors and friends to dinners and dances that revived the social life of the estate. I watched him change, day by day, as though the ice around his heart was slowly melting in the warmth of our love. He smiled more often. He laughed with the servants instead of commanding them in silence. He spent long hours in the gardens Lady Arabella had designed, not to mourn her anymore, but to honor her memory by keeping them beautiful and alive. And he spoke of her now, openly and without pain. He told me stories of their courtship, their wedding, the early years of their marriage when everything had seemed so bright and full of promise. He showed me her portrait, which he had kept covered in the attic, and together we hung it in the drawing room where it belonged. "She would have liked you," he said one evening, as we sat before the fire with Hope curled at our feet. "She had your same spirit, your same stubborn insistence on seeing the best in everyone." "I hope I can live up to her memory," I replied. He took my hand and pressed it to his lips. "You do not need to live up to anyone's memory, my love. You are extraordinary in your own right. That is why I fell in love with you." The seasons turned. Summer brought picnics in the meadow and long walks through the forest. Autumn brought the harvest festival, which Sebastian hosted with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone who had known him in his darker days. Winter brought Christmas, our first as husband and wife, and I decorated every room of Thornwood with holly and ivy and mistletoe, determined to fill the house with joy. And through it all, I kept writing. Not letters anymore, or household accounts, but stories. Stories of love and loss, of courage and kindness, of ordinary people who discovered extraordinary strength within themselves. Sebastian encouraged me, bought me the finest writing paper and pens, and read every word I produced with a pride that made my heart swell. "You should publish these," he said one evening, looking up from a story I had just completed. "The world deserves to read them." I laughed, certain he was teasing. Who would want to read stories by a former governess? "Everyone," he replied, and he was not teasing at all. Everyone who has ever felt alone or afraid or uncertain of their place in the world. You have a gift, Cecily. Do not let false modesty keep you from sharing it. I thought about his words for weeks afterward, and slowly, tentatively, I began to believe that he might be right. The following year, I submitted one of my stories to a London publisher. I did not expect anything to come of it. I told myself I was simply trying, simply seeing what would happen so that I could say I had at least made the attempt. But something did come of it. The publisher wrote back within a month, expressing interest in my work and asking if I had more stories to share. I did. I had dozens of them, filling notebooks and drawers and boxes throughout Thornwood. And over the next several years, I published them all under the name C.W. Fairfax, a name that belonged to both my past and my present. The stories were successful beyond my wildest dreams. They were read in drawing rooms across England, discussed in literary salons, praised by critics who had no idea that their author was a woman who had once been dismissed from service for feeding a stray dog. The irony was not lost on me, and I smiled every time I thought of it. But the greatest joy of those years was not the success of my stories, or the restoration of Thornwood, or even the slow healing of Sebastian's wounded heart. The greatest joy was simpler than that, more profound. It was the knowledge that I had found my place in the world. I had spent my early life searching for security, for stability, for a future that did not depend on the whims of others. I had worked and struggled and sacrificed, always believing that happiness was something to be earned, a reward for good behavior and careful planning. But I had been wrong. Happiness was not a destination. It was a choice. It was the decision to see beauty in small things, to find joy in unexpected places, to love fully and completely, even when it was frightening. It was feeding a starving dog in the rain, not because it was safe or sensible, but because it was right. And it was sharing that happiness with someone else. Someone who had also been lost, also been afraid, also been certain that love was too dangerous to risk. Someone who had found, in me, the same salvation I had found in him. We grew old together, Sebastian and I. We watched the seasons change, watched Thornwood flourish, watched the world transform around us in ways we never could have imagined. We had our sorrows, as all lives do. We lost friends, faced illness, weathered storms both literal and figurative. But we faced them together, always together, and that made all the difference. On our 20th anniversary, Sebastian gave me a gift. It was a painting, commissioned in secret, showing the two of us in the garden where I had once found hope. We were older in the painting, our hair touched with gray, our faces lined with the passage of time. But we were holding hands, and we were smiling, and there was a light in our eyes that spoke of a love that had only grown stronger with the years. I had this made, he said, so that we would always remember where we started and how far we have come. I looked at the painting through tear-blurred eyes. It was beautiful. It was perfect. It was everything. I do not need a painting to remember, I told him. Every moment with you is etched in my heart. He pulled me close, and I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. We stood there for a long time, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life together out of the ruins of their separate pasts. I love you, he murmured, more today than yesterday, more tomorrow than today. And I love you, I replied, forever and always. It is evening now, as I write these final words. The fire is burning low in the grate, and outside the window the stars are beginning to appear. Sebastian is dozing in his chair, Hope's great-great-granddaughter curled at his feet, and the house is quiet with the peace that comes at the end of a long, full day. I have lived a remarkable life. It was not the life I planned, not the life I expected, but it was mine, and it was beautiful. I found love where I least expected it, found courage I did not know I possessed, found happiness in the most unlikely of places. And it all began with a choice, a simple choice, made on a rainy afternoon to show kindness to a creature in need. I do not know what the future holds. I do not know how many more years I have, how many more stories I will write, how many more moments of joy and sorrow await me. But I know this: whatever comes, I will face it with an open heart. I will choose kindness even when it is difficult. I will choose love even when it is frightening. I will choose hope, always hope, because that is what makes us human. That is what makes life worth living. And that, in the end, is the greatest lesson I have learned. Not from books or teachers or the grand experiences of the world, but from a small, starving dog in a rain-soaked garden, and the man who learned to love again because I refused to let him hide. Kindness is never wasted. Love is never wrong. And the smallest acts of compassion can change the world. I am Cecily Fairfax, and this has been my story. I hope, dear reader, that it has brought you some measure of the joy it has brought me. And I hope, wherever you are, whatever struggles you face, that you too will find the courage to open your heart. The world needs more kindness. The world needs more love. The world needs more people who are brave enough to feed a starving dog in the rain, regardless of the consequences. Be one of those people. I promise you, it is worth it. It is always worth it.